Story 1. I'm writing this because I need to get it out of my head, and maybe someone can help me make sense of it. This happened last weekend in the Cairngorms. I'm 34, IT consultant in Edinburgh. I've been doing solo wild camping trips for about 6 years now, mostly bivvy camping because I like traveling light and I enjoy the exposure to the elements. My girlfriend thinks I'm mad, but it's how I decompress from work. Last Friday, I headed up to do a 2-night trip near Loch Avon, left around 2 p.m., parked at Glenmore, started hiking around 3:30. Standard gear, bivvy bag, sleeping bag, mat, stove, usual kit. Weather was supposed to be clear and cold, around freezing overnight. The walk-in took about 3 hours. I found a decent spot maybe 200 meters from the loch. Flat ground, sheltered by some big rocks, good views. Set up my bivvy, cooked dinner, watched the sunset. Everything normal. By 9 p.m. it was properly dark and I was settled in my sleeping bag, watching the stars. That's when I started hearing noises. At first I thought it was rockfall. You get that sometimes with temperature changes. But it kept happening. Every few minutes this clicking sound, like stones knocking together. It seemed to be coming from upslope, maybe 30 to 40 meters away. I turned on my headlamp and looked around. Couldn't see anything. The noise would stop when I turned the light on, then start again after I turned it off. This went on for maybe half an hour. I called out a few times, no response. I convinced myself it was natural. Rocks settling, maybe a deer or something. I'd been alone in the mountains dozens of times, never had an issue. I tried to sleep. I dozed off around 11, woke up suddenly at 1:48 a.m. I checked my watch because my heart was racing and I wanted to ground myself with something concrete. I had this overwhelming feeling that someone was watching me. You know that sensation? It was so strong it woke me up. I lay there in my bivvy bag, not moving, just listening. I could hear my own breathing, the wind, nothing else. But the feeling wouldn't go away. After a few minutes, I sat up and turned on my headlamp. Did a full sweep of the area. That's when I saw them, cairns, 4 of them arranged in an arc about 10 to 15 meters from where I was sleeping. I'm certain, absolutely certain, they weren't there when I'd set up camp. I'd walked all around this spot before dark. They weren't huge, maybe knee-to-waist height, but they were definitely deliberate, stacked carefully. I got out of my bivvy and walked over to the nearest one. The stones on top were still loose, not settled, fresh. I stood there with my headlamp trying to figure out what the hell was going on. Someone had built these while I was sleeping, which meant someone had been within a few meters of me, moving around in complete darkness, and I hadn't heard them, except for those clicking sounds earlier. I looked around for footprints, but the ground was too rough, just rocks and heather. I couldn't see any clear tracks. I called out again, "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice echoed off the rocks. Nothing. I'll be honest, I was scared. Not just startled, properly frightened. The idea that someone had been creeping around my campsite in the middle of the night, close enough to touch me, was terrifying. Were they watching me right now? Were they hiding behind the rocks? I made a decision. I was leaving. It was around 2 a.m., but I didn't care. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, kept my headlamp on, kept looking around. My hands were shaking. As I was stuffing my sleeping bag away, I heard something. Movement. Footsteps on loose rock, somewhere upslope in the darkness beyond my headlamp beam. Not running, just walking. Steady, coming from the direction where I'd heard the clicking earlier. I didn't wait to see who it was. I threw my pack on and started hiking out. I kept my headlamp pointed behind me as much as forward. For the first 15 to 20 minutes, I kept hearing sounds behind me. Footsteps. Someone was following me, staying just outside the range of my light. When I got to the main path near the river, the sound stopped. I practically ran the rest of the way to the car park. Got there around 4 a.m. Sat in my car until dawn because I didn't trust myself to drive. I was shaking too badly. I drove to Inverness, found a cafe, drank coffee until I could think straight. Then I called the local police non-emergency number. I told them what happened, that someone had been at my campsite, built cairns around me while I slept, followed me partway down the mountain. The officer I spoke to sounded bored, to be honest. He asked if anything was stolen. Was I threatened or assaulted? Did I see anyone? He basically told me that wild camping means dealing with other people outdoors, and that if I felt unsafe, I should stick to established campsites. When I pressed him about the cairns, he said hill walkers build them all the time, that maybe I'd walked past them in the evening and just didn't notice in the dark. I tried explaining that these were definitely built while I was asleep, that someone had been right next to me. He sighed and said, unless I had evidence of an actual crime, theft, damage to property, physical threat, there wasn't much they could do. He took my name and contact details, said they'd keep it on record, but I could tell he thought I was overreacting or making it up. So that was that. No help there. I've been going over it constantly since I got back. My girlfriend thinks I'm being paranoid. She reckons maybe there were cairns there already, and I just didn't see them properly when I set up camp. But I know what I saw. I walked around that entire area before pitching my bivvy. Those stones weren't there. My mate, who does a lot of hill walking, suggested maybe it was other campers messing about, trying to spook me for a laugh. That makes sense, I suppose. There are arseholes everywhere, even in the mountains. But why? What's the point? And why follow me down the trail? The more I think about it, the more questions I have. How did they move so quietly? I'm normally a light sleeper outdoors. I wake up when deer walk past, when the wind picks up. How did I not hear someone stacking rocks that close to me? The only sounds were those clicking noises earlier, which I assumed were natural. What if those clicks were deliberate? What if someone was already there when I arrived, watching to see where I'd camp, testing to see how alert I was? That thought makes my skin crawl. And here's what really gets me. Whoever it was knew that terrain well enough to move through it in complete darkness without a torch. The ground up there is rough. Loose rocks, heather, uneven terrain. You'd break an ankle if you didn't know exactly where you were going, which means they've been up there many times before, which means they might do this regularly. I looked online to see if anyone else has had similar experiences in that area. Found a few scattered mentions on hill walking forums, people reporting feeling watched, hearing footsteps at night, finding things moved around their campsites. Nothing concrete, just enough to make me feel like I'm not crazy. One comment stuck with me. Someone said they'd camped near Loch Avon 3 years ago and woke up to find their boots had been moved about 10 feet away from their tent during the night. They were certain they'd left them right by the entrance. Nothing else was touched, just the boots. They said it felt like someone was sending a message. I was here. I could have done worse. I haven't decided yet if I'll keep doing solo trips. Part of me wants to go back up there, maybe with a mate, see if we can figure out what's going on. But another part of me, the part that was terrified at 2 a.m. on that mountainside, says to just leave it alone. My girlfriend is pushing for the second option. She said there are plenty of other mountains in Scotland. No need to go back to that particular spot. She's probably right. But I keep thinking about those cairns, 4 of them arranged in a perfect arc, deliberately placed, deliberately spaced, built by someone who wanted me to see them, someone who's probably still up there. Story 2. I'm still processing what happened 2 nights ago, so bear with me if this is a bit scattered. Sarah and I broke up last Thursday, 3 years together, and it ended over something stupid. I don't even want to get into it. Point is, I needed to get away from the apartment, away from the city, away from everything. A mate suggested I try camping. I'd never been properly camping before, always thought it sounded miserable, but I was desperate for a distraction. Saturday morning, I drove up to Thetford Forest, about 90 minutes from my flat in Cambridge. Bought a cheap tent from Argos on the way, one of those pop-up ones for £35. Grabbed some basics, sleeping bag, torch, few tins of food. I didn't have a clue what I was doing, honestly. I got to the forest around 2 p.m., parked at one of the main car parks. There were designated camping areas, but they looked busy with families, and I wanted to be alone. I asked a dog walker if there were quieter spots, and he pointed me toward a trail that led deeper into the forest. Said there were some clearings about a mile in where people sometimes camp rough. The walk was nice. Gave me time to think, though mostly I just felt numb. Found a decent clearing around 3:30, flat ground surrounded by pine trees, far enough from the main paths that I couldn't hear other people. Perfect. Setting up the tent was a joke. Took me nearly an hour, and it still looked wonky, but it was up. I collected some wood, made a small fire, heated up some beans, sat there as it got dark, drinking the beers I'd brought, trying not to think about Sarah, trying not to check my phone to see if she'd texted. She hadn't. I crawled into the tent around 11 p.m. It was colder than I expected, and the sleeping bag was pretty thin, but I was tired enough not to care. I could hear the wind in the trees, some animal noises, probably foxes or deer or whatever. I put my earbuds in, listened to a podcast, and eventually fell asleep. I woke up to screaming. I don't know what time it was. I fumbled for my phone, and it was 2:47 a.m. The screaming was distant but clear. A woman's voice, high-pitched, absolutely terrified. It would stop for a few seconds, then start again, screaming, then what sounded like shouting, then more screaming. I sat up in my tent, heart absolutely pounding. The screams were coming from somewhere deeper in the forest, maybe 200 to 300 meters away. I unzipped the tent and stuck my head out. Complete darkness except for my phone's dim screen. The screaming continued. It sounded like someone was being hurt, like someone was being attacked. I grabbed my torch and stood outside the tent, shining it toward the sound. Nothing but trees. The screaming got louder, more desperate. Then I heard a man's voice shouting. I couldn't make out words, just angry yelling, then more screaming. My hands were shaking. I didn't know what to do. Should I go toward it? Should I call the police? I checked my phone. 1 bar of signal. Barely. I tried calling 999, but it wouldn't connect. Kept failing. The screaming went on for what felt like forever, but was probably 5 minutes. Then it stopped. Just stopped. Complete silence except for the wind. I stood there in the dark, listening. Nothing. My mind was racing. Someone had just been attacked, maybe killed. I was alone in the forest in the middle of the night, and someone out there was dangerous. I didn't sleep. I sat in my tent with the torch on, listening for any sound. Every crack of a branch made me jump. I kept expecting to hear footsteps, or see a light, or hear someone approaching. Nothing came. When dawn finally broke around 6:30 a.m., I packed up my tent as fast as I could. Didn't bother with breakfast, just shoved everything in my bag and started walking back to the car. My legs felt weak, like I'd run a marathon. I got to the car park around 7:15. There were a few other cars there, early morning dog walkers. I sat in my car for a bit, trying to decide what to do. I drove to the nearest village and found a police station, told them what I'd heard. The officer took down my details, asked where exactly I'd been camping. I showed him on a map as best I could. He nodded, said they'd send someone to check the area. Then he asked me a question that made my stomach drop. "Did you hear any foxes last night?" I said I didn't think so. Why? He said foxes mating sounds like a woman screaming, that it's really common for campers to call it in, thinking someone's being attacked. He said they get reports about it all the time, especially this time of year. I felt like an idiot, but I pushed back. I told him it didn't sound like an animal. It sounded human. And there was a man's voice too, shouting. He just nodded and said he'd have someone look into it, but I could tell he thought I was mistaken. I drove home feeling stupid and shaken. Looked up fox mating calls on YouTube when I got back. I'll admit, they do sound eerily human, but I don't know. What I heard sounded like words, like actual screaming with rhythm and panic. And that man's voice. That wasn't a fox. I checked the local news obsessively for the next 2 days. Nothing. No reports of attacks, no missing persons, nothing. I even drove back yesterday to the same car park, walked the trail again in daylight. I couldn't find the exact clearing where I'd camped, but I walked in the direction where I'd heard the screams. Didn't find anything unusual, no signs of disturbance, no police tape, nothing. So maybe the officer was right. Maybe it was just foxes and my exhausted emotional brain turned it into something it wasn't. Maybe being alone in the forest for the first time right after a breakup made me paranoid. But I keep coming back to that man's voice. Foxes don't shout. They don't yell in low, angry tones. That was human. I'm sure of it. I talked to my mate about it last night. He said even if it was people, it could have been anything. Teenagers messing about, someone drunk, a domestic argument, people doing drugs and freaking out, not necessarily anything sinister. He said the fact that there's been no news reports means it was probably nothing serious. He's probably right, but I can't shake the feeling that something bad happened out there, that someone needed help and I just stood there, frozen, doing nothing. I don't think I'll go camping again, not alone anyway, maybe not at all. Story 3. Posting this because I genuinely don't know what I witnessed, and part of me hopes someone here can explain it. This happened 4 days ago in the Willamette National Forest. Quick context. I'm 29, work remotely as a graphic designer, and I've gotten really into ultralight backpacking over the past year. I love finding dispersed camping spots way off the beaten path. The kind of places where you don't see another soul for days. I know some people call it stealth camping, but I always follow leave no trace principles and camp well away from trails. I'd planned a 3-day solo trip, starting from the Rebel Creek trailhead. My goal was to get about 8 miles in, then find somewhere to set up my tarp shelter near one of the smaller lakes that don't show up on most maps. I left my apartment in Eugene around 10 a.m. on Thursday, hit the trailhead by noon. The hike was pretty straightforward. Weather was perfect, mid-60s, partly cloudy, light breeze. I made good time and reached the lake area by 4 p.m. That's when things started feeling slightly off. There were footprints on the trail, fresh ones, probably from that morning. Multiple sets, maybe 5 or 6 people. Boots, various sizes. Nothing weird about that on its own. Group hikers are common, but these prints went way past where the official trail ended. They headed straight into the dense stuff where there's no marked path. I followed them for maybe 10 minutes, curious where they were going. The prints led to a game trail that wound through some thick hemlock and cedar. Then they just dispersed into the undergrowth. I figured the group must have split up to find campsites or something. I found my own spot about half a mile from where the footprints vanished. A flat area near a stream, good tree coverage, hidden from any direction. I strung up my tarp, laid out my sleeping quilt, got my water situation handled. By 7 p.m., I was eating my cold soak dinner, couscous with dried vegetables, glamorous stuff, and feeling pretty content. Around 8:30 p.m., still light enough to see, I heard voices. Distant, but definitely multiple people talking. They were somewhere across the stream, maybe 200 yards away. I couldn't make out words, but the tone was weird, sing-songy almost, like they were reciting something in unison. It went on for a few minutes, then stopped. I stayed quiet, didn't want to broadcast my location. Solo campers tend to keep a low profile, and I wasn't eager to socialize anyway. The voices didn't come back, so I figured they were just doing their own thing. Maybe some kind of religious group doing evening prayers or something. Whatever. I read my Kindle for a while, then settled in to sleep around 10 p.m. The temperature had dropped to maybe 45 degrees, cool but comfortable in my quilt. I was just drifting off when I heard movement nearby. Footsteps. Multiple people moving through the forest, no lights. This was maybe 11 p.m., pitch black under the tree cover. I stayed completely still under my tarp. The footsteps were slow, methodical. I could hear branches snapping, the swish of fabric against brush. They were close, within 50 feet, moving parallel to my position. Then they stopped. I held my breath, listening. Someone spoke, a woman's voice, very calm. "Here is fine." What happened next is the part I keep replaying. I heard them setting up camp, but wrong. There was no sound of tent poles, no zippers, no rustling of sleeping bags. Just this digging, like they were using sticks or their hands to dig into the forest floor. This went on for at least 20 minutes, scraping, digging, moving earth. Then came the chanting again. 6 or 7 voices, all in sync, speaking words I didn't recognize. Not Spanish, not any language I've heard. It had this rhythmic quality, rising and falling. They kept it up for about 10 minutes. Then silence. I barely slept. Every time I started to doze, I'd hear small sounds from their direction. Rustling, whispers. Once what sounded like someone crying very quietly. At one point, maybe 3 a.m., I heard footsteps again. Someone walking around the perimeter of their camp. The steps would stop for a minute, then continue. Stop. Continue. Like they were pacing or keeping watch. Dawn finally came around 6:15 a.m. I waited until there was proper light before I moved. I packed up as quietly as possible, my hands shaking. I wanted to get out without them noticing me, but here's where my stupid curiosity kicked in. I crept toward where I'd heard them. I told myself I just needed to see which direction to avoid. But really, I wanted to know what they'd been doing all night. I found their spot easily. The disturbed earth was obvious. They'd dug shallow trenches in the ground, maybe 6 or 7 of them. Each one was about 5 feet long and maybe a foot deep, arranged in this weird radial pattern like spokes on a wheel. The dirt was mounded up between them. Inside each trench were branches laid across, and what looked like dried grass or moss packed underneath. The strange part was there was literally no camping equipment. No tents, no tarps, no sleeping pads, no backpacks, nothing. Just these dugout trenches with organic material in them. Who hikes miles into the backcountry with nothing? And there was this smell, hard to describe, organic, earthy, but sour, kind of like compost that's gone wrong. It made my stomach turn. I looked around for any sign of where they'd gone. The ground was trampled flat around the trenches, but I couldn't find any clear tracks leading away. The morning dew made the ground pretty trackable, and I could see my own footprints clearly coming in, but nothing obvious leading out. Maybe they were just better at not leaving trace than I was. I heard voices again then, low murmuring, coming from deeper in the trees. They were still nearby. That's when I decided I'd seen enough. I backed away carefully, trying not to make noise, and headed back to my tarp. I packed up the rest of my stuff in about 5 minutes flat and started hiking out. The whole way back, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me. But I made it to the trailhead without incident, got to my car around 9 a.m. I sat there for probably half an hour, trying to decide if I should report this to someone. But report what exactly? That I saw some people camping weird? That they dug trenches instead of using tents? It's not illegal to be strange in the woods. I drove home and tried to forget about it, but I keep thinking about those trenches. Why would anyone dig them? Why arrange them in that specific pattern? And where the hell was their gear? You can't survive out there with nothing, especially overnight when it dropped into the 40s. I did some Googling when I got back, tried searching for primitive camping techniques and survival shelters and stuff like that. The trenches don't match anything I found. Debris huts, yes. Lean-tos, sure, but not trenches arranged in a circle with branches laid across them. I found one old forum post from 2021 where someone mentioned hearing chanting near one of the Willamette Lakes at night. They thought it was some kind of spiritual retreat group. The replies were all jokes about druids and witches. Nobody took it seriously. The thing that really bothers me is the footsteps I heard circling their camp at 3 a.m. Why would someone do that? Were they keeping watch? Guarding against something? Or was it part of whatever ritual or ceremony they were doing? I've told one person about this, my roommate. He thinks I probably stumbled on some wilderness therapy group or maybe people doing some kind of primitive skills course. That makes sense, I guess. But wouldn't they have instructors? Wouldn't there be some kind of base camp with actual supplies? I'm supposed to go on another trip next weekend, different area. I'm still planning to go, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't more nervous now. I keep thinking about how close they were to my tarp. 50 feet, maybe less. They had to have known I was there. Nobody's that loud moving through the woods unless they don't care about being heard, or unless they wanted me to hear them. I don't know what I witnessed. Maybe it was completely innocent, just people practicing primitive camping techniques or doing some kind of spiritual thing, but something about it felt off. The organization of it, the deliberateness, the complete lack of normal camping gear, and that smell. I can't get that smell out of my head. If anyone's familiar with that area or has seen anything similar, I'd really appreciate hearing about it. I'm not trying to be dramatic or make something out of nothing. I just want to understand what I saw.